Hi, I'm Monita, Senior Editor for Teaching Tolerance, and a special thing for me about this story was that no matter how hard it is to dig into the history of slavery, the Black teachers I talked to about teaching their Black students leaned into those feelings of pain and hurt so that they could teach their students accurately and authentically. And so I hope you learn from their wisdom and enjoy the story.
When the sun comes back, when the first quail calls, follow the drink and go. For the old man is waiting for, carry you to freedom, follow.
Slavery was woven into the fabric of the new United States from the very beginning, but it undergoes a transformation beginning in the 1790s with the rise of cotton. The rise of the slave economy of the 19th century has to do with the territorial expansion of the United States, both through diplomacy and the expulsion of indigenous communities. It has to do with the transfer of labor to these new plantation areas through the slave trade. It also has to do with the migration of planters and capital to these new regions. So one family that I think illustrates that reality is the Palfrey family. John Palfrey was a Boston merchant, a little bit down on his luck. And just after the Louisiana Purchase, he sees a whole new field for profit in these new lands acquired by the United States. So he moves to New Orleans with 4 of his sons, and they establish a cotton plantation in a remote frontier region of Louisiana known as Attakapas. So they purchase land. Palfrey also purchases 21 people, men, women, and children, who he transplants to this new land in Attakapas. They turn a piece of wilderness, really, into a cotton plantation. And it's the labor, it's the hands, the arms, the muscle, the know-how of those enslaved men, women, and children that make that land profitable. Among the Palfrey family papers is a really remarkable document that sheds light on the workings of the cotton plantation. It's a tally of the weight of cotton that was picked by each enslaved person on the Palfrey plantation for a year, day by day. We know from that record that about 40% of the cotton that was picked by children. Another 40% was picked by women. So the vast majority of the cotton picked on Palfrey's plantation was picked by women and children. But to really understand the nature of the cotton economy of the early 19th century, we have to follow that cotton from the Palfrey plantation to where it ended up. Because the plantation on the remote Louisiana frontier was part of a vast Southern, national, and even international economy, one of the first global economies of the modern era. So that cotton picked by those women and children would be hauled to New Orleans. In New Orleans, bales of cotton would be put on ocean-going vessels. Those ships would then transport it to New York or Boston, or even more likely, to Liverpool, where that cotton would then supply the raw material that fueled probably the greatest industrial interest of the first half of the 19th century, cotton textile manufacturing. It was cotton textiles that made the Industrial Revolution go, and that cotton came from the Deep South. So it'd be woven into yarn, the yarn into fabric, the fabric into clothes, and those clothes would then be sold across the world, really. The profits that are made off of the backs of slaves in the Cotton Kingdom, some of it ends up flowing to the hands of cotton brokers in New York, to the insurance companies that are beginning to insure the lives of slaves against death and disease. The profits are going to the hands of the shipping companies that are carrying the cotton from New Orleans to New York and to Liverpool. So there are these multiplier effects of slave labor that end up funneling profits into the coffers of Northern and European business as well.
When we think of the wealth of colonial America and ultimately the United States, you cannot point to a more primary source than slavery. Elizabeth Key was the daughter of Thomas Key, who was a legislator from Virginia, and an unnamed, probably enslaved African woman. Before Thomas Key died, he willed that his daughter, Elizabeth Key, would be freed at 15 years old. Her new master decided to defy the wishes of Thomas Key and kept her enslaved. On a plantation, she actually met this white indentured servant who was around her age by the name of William Greenstead, who had some legal training. And the two of them developed a romantic relationship and had a child. When her new master died in 1655, William Greenstead and Elizabeth Key sued for the freedom of Elizabeth Key as well as their newborn child. And they won. They won their case. And they won their case because Elizabeth Key made the case that her father was free and she was a Christian. And in British law, and Virginia in 1655 was a British colony, in British law, you could not enslave a Christian, and the status of the child was derived from the father. And so again, Elizabeth Key was like, my father is free and I'm a Christian, so I should be free. And by 1657, that case had been resolved and she won her freedom. And so other enslaved Africans who were also Christian and their fathers were white, they were the product of a white man and an African woman, also began suing for their freedom. So by the 1660s, Virginia leaders who were slaveholders began to recognize that more and more enslaved Africans were basically winning their freedom. And so they had to change the laws in order to keep these people enslaved. These people who slaveholders had invested a tremendous amount of money in, and the new laws stated that the status of the child derived from the mother, and that Christians, enslaved Christians, could not basically sue for their freedom on the basis of their new Christianity. And so that was able to quash or stop these freedom suits. These new laws in the 1660s showed just how critical the maintenance of keeping people, Black people, enslaved was to the lifeblood of Virginia, a colony that was seeking to grow its wealth by planting tobacco, which was the major product at the time in colonial Virginia, a product that was sweeping England and Midwestern Europe in its popularity. And in order to do so, they needed a pretty steady labor force, and that steady labor force was increasingly enslaved Africans who were permanently enslaved, in contrast to white indentured servants who in a few years could basically become free.
When we ask a question about where are the origins of white supremacy, where are the origins of racism, they are very much in the founding of the nation itself, in our earliest stories. Slavery and race in North America grow up together. Part of what colonial lawmakers are deeply invested in is creating categories, boxes, and keeping people separate from one another as a tactic to then organize society, subject some people to wholesale exclusion. A story is going to be told about Africans as particularly suited to do the kinds of agricultural labor that colonial officials imagine will bring prosperity, the production, for example, of tobacco. They're telling those stories and developing these ideas because they believe it's an effective technique. It might be an effective technique for making the colony an economically productive enterprise. That's all racism is a set of ideas, wrong ideas, but powerful ideas about why people of African descent are especially suited to do the work. Out of the colonial period, out of the American Revolution, there emerges a question. Slavery might end. It might not end for some years, perhaps some decades, but it appears that slavery is going to end, certainly in the North, and perhaps throughout the country over time. It's one observation. And the second observation is that as slavery comes to an end, slowly and gradually, there will emerge communities of free people of color who are going to build institutions and families, become part of the economic fabric of life in these cities. What to do if you have a growing community of free people of color, and yet your vision is one of a white man's country. Enter colonizationists. And what colonizationists propose is that they will raise money, they will found a colony in West Africa that comes to be called Liberia, and they will, by the offering up of resources, they will try and persuade free people of color to leave the country. This is a movement that gets formalized in the 18-teens. The American Colonization Society gives a kind of institutional home to colonizationist ideas. Colonization becomes the most popular political movement of the early 19th century. Ordinary Americans sign on to this idea that the future of the country is governed by, dominated by, run by white Americans, and free African Americans have no future. There's only probably less than 10,000 people of African descent who even seriously entertain the notion of colonization, no less board a ship for a place like Liberia. The numbers are small, but for thinking about the long history of white supremacy, what we have to appreciate is that even as people of African descent remain in place, they live in a world where the majority of white people around them have signed on to a political movement that says they shouldn't be there, that is committed to white supremacy, whether people of African descent are literally removed or whether they remain under subordinated circumstances. This is a world in which colonization has given everybody a language, an organization, a political movement around which white supremacy as we know it coalesces.
The central cause of the American Civil War was slavery. The people who lived during the time had no question about what the central cause was. It's only after the war, during the remembrance periods and the memorial periods and the memoir period, that people start looking for another reason, another example. I work at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. And frequently, people who come through the door with a lot of questions. And it's always about, what is the Civil War about? At the eve of the American Civil War, the states that will eventually make up the Confederate States of America combined have the 6th largest economy in the world. What is at the core of these states' economies? Slavery. It is the largest enterprise. It is where the greatest amount of wealth is held is in human beings and the products that are produced by them. So they have no reason to think that they cannot support themselves. They have no reason to think that they cannot have a nation that at its cornerstone is these two extremely important ideas to them. And that was, number one, slavery was the natural position for Africans. And number two, that white folks were superior and they were willing to build a nation on those two cornerstone concepts. And they did. When you look at all of the secession documents that were put forth and the proclamations and the resolutions, they are very clear that slavery is central to, quote, our way of life, that there is a feeling that the election of Abraham Lincoln and the rise of this new Republican Party was a threat to that. Slavery is not just an agrarian system. Slavery is being used in factories, it's being used in homes, it's being used in commercial businesses, and of course, it's being used in fields of varying types. At the time, especially in the South, the key to gaining wealth often was through the institution of slavery. So the American dream was as much about getting land and then having slaves to work it. That's where people saw their path to greater wealth and opportunity for themselves and their families, creating generational wealth. And this is a society that does elevate white people simply by being white above black people or any other person of color that was around at the time. It is a system where one aspires to having that level of wealth and power and control that slaveholders had. While slavery definitely existed in some northern states, the difference is many of those northern economies were not solely based on slavery. They tended to have a much more mixed economic model. The Confederacy absolutely went to war to preserve the institution of slavery. This is what they meant by preserving our way of life. The northern states, however, they don't go to war to end slavery. They go to war to preserve the United States as a whole unit. It is not until later, after 1863, that the American Civil War becomes a war for freedom.
Enslaved people engaged in a variety of resistance tactics. Much of their resistance was intended to ameliorate the daily conditions of their bondage. So people might pilfer food from the garden or from their master's kitchen to supplement their own meager diets. People might feign illness or work at a slower pace than was demanded by their master, again, to give their bodies and their souls a time to rest and recuperate from the grueling pace of labor on most plantations. Enslaved people also gathered at night, right? They came together to pray, to socialize. Young people would come together to court each other, right? Effectively to date and to socialize. And so all of these kinds of behaviors we can think of as resistance because they violated slaveholders' demands about labor patterns. They violated slaveholders' wishes about food rations. They violated slaveholders' efforts to control the use of space. Slaveholders, southern communities, counties, and states passed legislation restricting enslaved people's gatherings, right? Decreeing that enslaved people could not gather on their own without a free white person monitoring them. And yet enslaved people did gather on their own, under the cover of night, in the woods, in secret locations. And they gathered for their own purposes, whether they were religious or social. But they gathered to affirm their humanity with each other, to foster and sustain emotional and social relationships with each other.
In terms of running away, it's actually more common for that to be temporary, just running away for a few hours to visit a spouse on another plantation, Running away for a few days is kind of a way to protest against labor conditions if you're unhappy about something. But in general, most runaways ultimately came back voluntarily, but they often did it as a way to kind of negotiate with their masters, kind of showing that I can run away whenever I want. If you don't let me visit my wife more, if you don't let me labor alongside of my children, I'm going to do this again. So it was kind of this way of resisting and negotiating with the masters.
Masters would use runaway slave ads to recover their slaves who have decided to leave the plantations or leave their houses, leave their service. In the ads, a master would list what the slave looked like. So they might mention certain physical features. Many people who are coming directly from Africa have what are known as country marks. And so they might list those country marks that a person has. They will speak about or write about what, whether that person knows English or not. Do they know a little bit of English, a lot of English, no English at all? These ads would also mention how the person might have ran away, where they might have run away to, who they ran away with. So often you have groups of people running away, and in some interesting situations you actually have white servants running away with African slaves. You also have certain instances where you have a slave and a free person of color running away. So that might be mentioned. And of course, in any runaway slave ad, you're going to have a reward. These people are worth money, and in order to encourage people to recover them, you have to offer money to get them back.
Of course, slave rebellion is the kind of the ultimate form of resistance. But in general, that doesn't happen very frequently. There's a handful of large-scale rebellions in North America. But for the most part, it seems that slaves realize that they simply wouldn't be successful. They know that the whites, even though there may be less of them in some places on particular plantation regions, they have the guns, they have the power of the law to back them up. And so kind of resisting in violent means is often suicidal, and they're aware of that. Slave owners are very aware that slavery is dangerous. They know that that their property has the potential to kill them. And they take precautions against that. They have slave patrols at night, so they see any black person walking on the road, they're supposed to stop them and question them, make sure they have a pass from their owner saying they have permission to be out. And of course, there's all sorts of brutal punishments, whippings, things like that, intended to terrify other slaves into obedience. And it's not just the power of the slaveholders, they have the power of the state and the law to back them up. If slaves if they openly resist, if they fight back when they're being whipped, it's not just the slaveholder will whip them more, he can then turn them over to the state who will execute them for striking a white person, for example.
One of the most striking and dramatic slave rebellions in the 18th century is the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in September 1739. In this rebellion, a group of West African men who were brought from the West African coast to South Carolina, drew on their military training to organize a rebellion against South Carolina's slaveholders. They organized and planned their rebellion with a keen understanding of local political and social conditions. That is, they organized their rebellion to take place just before a South Carolina law that would require white men to carry guns to church went into effect. The South Carolina rebels, led by a man named Jemmy, aimed to get to Georgia and then to Florida. They hoped to get to Florida because Florida was a Spanish colony, and the Spanish had offered freedom to any enslaved person coming from a British colony and arriving in the Spanish colony of Florida. So they had a very keen understanding of the political terrain in which they were operating, right? These rebels knew that they had to get to Florida in order to secure their full liberation from slavery. They knew, for example, that the Spanish colonial government was eager to destabilize the British colonies, and that the Spanish colonial government knew that one way to strike at the British colonies was to strike at the institution of slavery. And so for this group of enslaved West African men, planning their rebellion with the goal of getting to Florida was a way of capitalizing on European politics in North America. So they engage in this bloody rebellion, they kill a number of slaveholders. Interestingly, they make the decision to spare the slaveholders and merchants who were known to be kind to the enslaved people they own, but they had no qualms about fighting their revolution for freedom by striking out at the slaveholders who were known to be cruel and especially violent and exploitative. In the end, the Stono Rebellion is put down. South Carolina and Georgia militia finally succeed at killing and capturing most of the rebels. And in an act of real violence and demonstrating the threat and power of these slaveholding colonies, the rebels are beheaded and their heads are placed on pikes along the road from South Carolina to Florida as a warning to other enslaved men and women not to rebel, right? The decapitation would be the fate that awaited any future rebels. The Stono Rebellion is important because it allows us to see the presence of African culture and knowledge in the American colonies. It allows us to understand the ways in which African and then later generations of African American slaves were able to draw on African knowledge, but were also able to form bonds in America to create alliances and to strategize and resist with the intention of overthrowing slavery.
Ona Judge was born at Mount Vernon around 1774. She was the daughter of Betty, an enslaved seamstress. Based on Judge's last name, her father may have been Andrew Judge, a white English tailor whom Washington hired from 1772 to 1784. Ona was later described as a light mulatto girl, much freckled and almost white. At age 10, she became Martha Washington's personal maid. Like her mother, Judge was skilled at sewing. Washington once referred to her as the perfect mistress of her needle. Also, like her mother, Judge and her younger sister, Delphi, belonged to the Custis estate. Upon Martha Washington's death, they would pass on to her heirs. When George Washington was elected president, 15-year-old Judge traveled to the executive residence first in New York, then in Philadelphia. Judge continued her daily work, waiting on Martha Washington, helping her bathe and dress, cleaning and mending her clothing, organizing her personal belongings, and anything else her mistress wanted. But in the bustling capital city of Philadelphia, life was dramatically different from Mount Vernon. In an effort to appease or distract from the temptation of gradual abolition laws of Philadelphia, Judge received nominal cash wages and, on several occasions, money to go see a play, the circus, and the tumbling feats. Washington account books note purchases for her gowns, shoes, stockings, and bonnets. The city's large free Black and Quaker abolitionist communities also offered the young woman new ideas, connections, and opportunities to escape. On May 20th, 1796, as the Washingtons prepared to return to Mount Vernon for the summer, Judge fled. She recalled in 1845, "Whilst they were packing to go up to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, my things carried there beforehand, and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner." 2 days later, an advertisement was placed in the Philadelphia Gazette and the Universal Daily Advertiser announcing that she had absconded from the president's house and offered a $10 reward for her capture. After leaving the Washington's household, Judge secured passage on the Nancy, a ship bound for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Even in New Hampshire, Judge was not safe. Just a few months after arriving, she was recognized on the street by a friend of Martha Washington's granddaughter. Word of the escapee's whereabouts reached the Washington, who enlisted the help of Joseph Whipple, a customs collector. He found Judge and tried to convince her to return. Judge replied that she would readily return, but only if the Washingtons promised to free her after their deaths. Otherwise, she said, she should rather suffer death than to return to slavery and liable to be sold or given to any other person. When Washington learned of Judge's request, he was furious. Washington told Whipple to keep trying, but Judge continued to refuse. In 1797, Judge married Jack Staines, a free black sailor. The couple had 3 children, Eliza, Will, and Nancy. Washington would try again to recapture Judge in August of 1799, and again she would not return to slavery. After Washington's death in December of 1799, Judge said, "The family never troubled me anymore." She nevertheless remained a fugitive. The Custis estate could legally recapture her and her children at any time. In an interview later in life, Judge revealed that she had 2 reasons for running away. First, she wanted to be free. And second, she had overheard that she would soon be given to Martha Washington's eldest granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis Law, who was known to have a fierce temper. Judge was determined, she recalled, never to be her slave. By the 1840s, legally, Judge was considered a pauper and received support from Rockingham County. Her husband and 3 children had predeceased her. One interviewer asked if she was sorry she'd left the Washingtons, and Judge responded, "No, I am free and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means."